Hi, my name's Randall Baron Chong, Executive Director of Pathfinders for Ukraine. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation of our study, A Path Forward, where we make the case for a PR program that addresses the needs and recognizes the circumstances of war-displaced Ukrainians in Canada. Now, what the genesis of all this was our team, which is largely made up of CUAET holders themselves, uh, started a lot of our meetings talking about some of the uncertainties and anxieties they had about obtaining PR. And we started to wonder, well, if this is happening with our team, which is really, young, promising, hardworking CUAET holders here in Canada with families starting new lives, if this was happening to them, surely this must be happening across many of the thousands of CUAET holders in Canada. And so we decided to do a study to explore those questions and to determine what the size of this challenge was. And hence we came up with a path forward. So what I'll be sharing with you today is the presentation that synthesizes the findings of our survey and what we are recommending to government. This study was shared with Minister Miller on October 16th of this year and is now being published so that we may share with everyday Canadians and other stakeholders about the case that we make for PR. So without further ado, here's our presentation of our report. So a little bit about us is that Pathfinders for Ukraine was an organization that I started back in March of 2022 when as a half Ukrainian, the Baran in Baron Chong is Ukrainian, I felt called to do something at the onset of the full-scale invasion. So I ended up quitting my job where I was living in Amsterdam as a global director in a large consulting firm and really tried to walk the path to understand what's the journey, the challenges, and the areas of need for war-displaced Ukrainians in the early days of the war. So the day of full scale, I quit. About a week later, I was in Poland, and then not long after that, I was crossing the border into Ukraine, walking across the border at Medica, visiting shelters, and ultimately, our organization started to build some momentum and bring people in, and we ended up being headquartered at Warsaw Central Station. So we are a registered nonprofit organization, all volunteer, and we have no political affiliations and receive no government funding, so we can be objective and independent with the kind of analysis and recommendations we make. I think one of the things that we're most proud of as an organization is that a significant portion of our team are actual CUET holders, war-displaced Ukrainians themselves. So we are really trying to provide a voice for them to understand their issues and to work together between Canadians and these war-displaced Ukrainians to make a difference. So you see there 63% of our team are war-displaced Ukrainians and about half of our leadership as well. And so we've really focused, on today focusing on the advocacy work, but we're really rooted in understanding the entire journey. As I mentioned, we were based in Poland, where we helped from day one of the CUET program with providing information and some support for people who are applying for CUET. We partnered with organizations that were helping people get on flights as aid was being flown in. We got people on the flights out. We even built an app to help answer one of those questions, which is, which city should I go to? So we built kind of the first ever jobs-led city selection tool, which used jobs data from the government at the NOC code level to identify which cities were hiring those particular job categories the most, and which cities had the kind of greatest demand for those people because had a lot of vacancies. And then in those city profiles, we had information about the wages, the cost of living, and the resettlement agencies that could support you along that way. So we've really been focused on understanding and supporting that entire journey. And here we are back in Canada now, focusing on, now that folks are settled here and the CUET program is over, how do we provide them a more stable path forward? So as I mentioned, this is where we, in the summer, started to decide that we really wanted to study this question around PR. And as I mentioned, we are a fully independent organization, so we could approach this objectively, ask the tough questions, and ask those questions so that CUAET holders don't feel any kind of threat of repercussion based upon the answers that they provided. So we launched this fully anonymized kind of survey where we conducted it over September 5th to 12th of this year in Ukrainian and English. Once we kind of got our data, since then there have been other people who have done studies, and we've been able to kind of cross-reference it against that to sense check it. But we've also been able to obtain data from the IRCC through an access to information request we've made. So we've been able to root it in both our survey insights, which really captures new data that wasn't really out there before, with some of those other data points. And we were able to share this report in its first version with Minister Miller, the Canadian Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship, on October 16th of this year, as well as several other MPs and stakeholders on the Hill. And in terms of our survey, as we launched it, we had over 1,200 families reply to it. 920 or so were CUAET holding families in Canada, about 270 CUAET holding families that were still abroad but not yet come to Canada. And that roughly represents about 3,600 CUAET holders in terms of individuals. So we got a really good kind of representation of people. And part of our survey focused on those that had already arrived. And then we also tried to get some insights on people yet to come. And I'm sure many of you who are watching this right now actually were people who responded to the survey. So thank you for your participation, and thank you for making your voice heard, because we're using it to help inform some of the recommendations that we're making in this report. And what we've done with all of these insights from this survey, I believe there were close to 60 questions or so, we've been able to synthesize that into this full report. So what you're seeing today is just the kind of summary of this report, but we've got about a 37-page report which really captures all the different insights, both in terms of the respondents, like what's the individual and family profiles. So what is it that their composition looks like? What was their situation in Ukraine prior to the full-scale invasion? What's their journey to Canada been like, and what's been their experiences and resettlement so far? We really dove deeply into the PR pathways that were being pursued and what were some of the uncertainties around that. We also asked questions about their future outlook. What was it that they viewed not only on the war itself, but also their kind of future pathways? What was it that they envisioned for their life going forward, depending on how things played out? And then finally, we include a kind of analysis of our considerations and recommendations, not only to the federal government, but to war-displaced Ukrainians themselves, and to everyday Canadians who care about this cause. So to put things into context, if you remember, when CUAET was designed from the very beginning, and when it launched on March 17th of 2022, it was one of the kind of first programs outside of the EU that really tried to address the situation. It was one of the largest kind of undertakings by the IRCC in their history in terms of the amount of resources, the speed, and the scale of the kind of operation to process all these applicants. And from its design perspective, it was intended as a temporary safe haven until it is safe for them to return home. That's how it was described on the website. Now, there are some important characteristics to point out about the program. So the first is that it does not grant Ukrainians refugee status. You may see in the media or some organizations mistakenly refer to Ukrainians as refugees, which is a kind of specified legal class and has certain benefits and entitlements to it. But that was not what this program was. It was not a refugee program. And that'll play out later on, as we'll discuss in the report. The second thing was that it was really built on this assumption that that war-displaced Ukrainians would want to return to Ukraine at the end of the war. And then the third thing that we wanted to point out was that while it certainly was very open and accommodating to Ukrainian nationals, it was, let's say, less generous in terms of the financial housing support that was guaranteed and provided to the Ukrainians, let's say, compared to other countries in the EU like Germany or the UK. Who had kind of these housing schemes that were guaranteed with hosts or with stipends that were provided to them every month. So there was a real kind of difference in terms of, what kind of benefits were guaranteed for those who arrived. And one of the things that we've been told so far in terms of the future of CUAET, and even from how it was designed from the beginning, that there were geopolitical factors, meaning that messaging from the government of Ukraine that they wanted their people back really influenced the program's design and continue to have influence on whether a PR program for CUAET will happen. And so what are the results of the CUAET program, which closed in July 14th of this year? Well, there's been 1.2 million applicants, which is about 3 to 4 times the number of applicants to the UK or the US programs. Those are different types of programs, but the sheer size of this is astounding. There have been 936,000 approved. 210,000 have arrived, which means that of those that have been approved thus far, the 210,000 that have arrived represent only 22% of the total approved population, meaning there's, at the current time, about 726,000 who have been approved but not yet arrived. Now, this is the data as at November 28th of 2023, so it's the most recent data that the IRCC has published publicly, and that will obviously change over time as more approvals happen. So what have we found so far? If we had to summarize what our findings from our report are compared to the way that CUAET was designed. So the first assumption that we wanted to test and can now challenge is that those who came to Canada did so with long-term intentions. 90% of the war-displaced Ukrainians we surveyed here in Canada want to pursue PR. And we'll talk about our kind of observations, even when we were in Poland and talking to people about whether they wanted to make the choice to come to Canada, that there was a clear sense of intentionality as to why they came to Canada. The second is that the existing PR routes, so under the current immigration schemes that at both the federal and provincial level, do not fit the profile of a war-displaced person. And so from our data, we find that only 30% of the war-displaced population respondents say they are confident in their ability to receive PR. And that includes the ones who would be under the family reunification program that was announced on October 23rd of this year. And then finally, we really believe that there is an economic, humanitarian, Canadian public support and rebuild by diaspora case to be made to give a specified route to PR. So let's talk a little bit about the respondents themselves and what they left behind in Ukraine. So in our respondents, close to 3/4 of those folks were in Ukraine as at February 24th, 2022, the first day of full-scale invasion. So these are people that were, really touched by the war. And so what's interesting is this next statistic, which says that 88% of those respondents said that they had some form of impact directly on their life from the war. So it may be a combination of many of these things. Some had one, some had a few, but you see here it ranges from, things like post-traumatic stress disorder to, significant financial losses, career disruption, or even for 23% of people, the loss of loved ones, or 25% had lost property. So there's a real kind of direct impact on the lives of these people. And then when it came to the making the efforts to come to Canada, they did so at significant personal expense. And especially when you think about it in the context that Ukraine's GDP per capita is about a third of Canada's, you really understand how much it means to go out of pocket at these kind of costs here to make the effort to come to Canada. So, for the average that we saw across the different kind of configurations of families, so combinations of families that came, so whether it's people came alone, with a spouse, with kids and grandparents, we saw an average of about $6,800 was the spend. And if you multiply that by three, that's how much it would have been like to a Canadian to go out of pocket. So there's a real kind of investment that was made by them to make their way over, because not everyone was lucky enough to get Miles for Migrants or was able to work with us to get either private sponsorship for flights or get onto the Samaritan's Purse flight, etc. So when the folks have gotten here, what's been their experience like so far? Well, in terms of a question of like, were they happy with where they ended up? This was a kind of question mark for us as we saw many of the early war-displaced Ukrainians that came to us in Poland at the Warsaw desk. We asked them where they wanted to go. Many said Toronto because it was the city that they knew. And that's part of the reason why we built the app Where to Go Canada, to really help maybe give them a different insight of different cities that were available. But you see here that 74% were happy with the first place that they chose. Although you see here that some people have made the decision to move within Canada, or some have even, made the kind of regret of potentially moving back to Ukraine. But for the large part, most people are happy with their decision to come to Canada and may have relocated within the province or in another part of Canada. You see here in the middle that many have established community roots. And what we mean by that is that people have started to integrate into Canadian society. So, beyond just finding long-term housing, which we all know is a really difficult thing, especially in provinces like Ontario, but they've also started to make the effort to become a part of the working society here in Canada. They're attending language classes, 46%. 43% here say they have kids attending school. They're making friends with, their local communities. They're not only kind of getting involved in volunteering with community groups, but we've heard great stories of people sharing Ukrainian language and dance and song with Canadians. So we're really seeing the Ukrainians make an effort to thrive in society. And one of the kind of key markers of success in settlement is, of course, employment. Now, what we have here is showing the employment rate while they were in Ukraine in that left bar. And you see in the right bar their employment rate in Canada. And you see here that, of course, as would be expected, it's not as high as it was in a new country. But if you consider many of these folks have been here for a year, maybe a bit more than a year, 76% overall employment rate is quite good. And 62% of those are in full-time employment. Now, as we know, many of the Ukrainians are highly educated and quite high skilled. And one of the things where we see some of the trapped potential within Ukrainians, something that could be solved with PR, is that 50% here, if you see that chart at the bottom right there, 50% are working in a sector and at a level that is different than where they were in Ukraine prior to the full scale. So we see this as trapped potential, which could potentially be solved with greater kind of certainty around their residency status by being able to access resident rates for tuition and things like that. So, while there is pretty good employment rates, We see Ukrainians as this trapped potential within them to do even better things, earn better incomes, and contribute more to Canadian society as taxpayers, and sharing that kind of experience and skills that they brought with them from Ukraine. So that's been their settlement experience so far. One of the questions we wanted to ask them is what's their outlook for what's going to happen in the future when it comes to broader kind of issues? So we asked them, what's their outlook on the future of the war? And so 25% said that they believe the war will end within the next 3 years. Why that's relevant is that um, for many of these folks, the 3 year kind of window describes the open work permit or study permit term. And so the question is, do people believe at the end of 3 years that the war will be over so that they're able to safely return to their country? And so obviously here, 75% do not believe that's the case. In fact, many are unsure of when the war will end or if it will ever end. And so this really puts a dilemma on whether the CUAET program in its 3 year term is appropriate for a war that really doesn't have a clear kind of conclusion or horizon. And one of the other questions we wanted to ask was, okay, so uh, if you will be here in Canada, and we know that the effort to rebuild Ukraine will be the largest since the Second World War, uh, how will you contribute to the rebuild of Ukraine? And I can tell you, as a half Ukrainian myself, my grandparents who left after the destruction of the Second World War um, continued to give to Ukraine, to family, to organizations. They donated money, clothes, books, everything, up until the day that they died. Because, as we know, Ukrainians don't cease to be Ukrainians just because they've crossed a border. It's within their kind of souls and their DNA. And so, as you can see here, 99% of the respondents said that they would support the rebuild in some form. And 68% of them would support through remittances. So sending funds either directly to family or to organizations that are supporting rebuild. And in fact, 17% said that they would want to actually work for a Canadian company that is directly involved in rebuild. And we've seen many companies in Canada put their hand up to support with things like rebuilding infrastructure, hydroelectric plants, hospitals, and other infrastructure. So they want to keep their ties and contribute to their country, despite the fact that they may be here in Canada. So I mentioned earlier that we really didn't suspect that there was a blanket way to describe a war-displaced Ukrainian, especially there was a difference between the war-displaced Ukrainian that was still in Europe versus the war-displaced Ukrainian that went to Canada. And as I mentioned, when we were at Warsaw Central Station or the shelters in Global Expo Center or the large ones, all across Warsaw or in Lviv International Center, etc., um, we saw the discussions happening with our desk versus, let's say, in Przemyśl, where there was about 12 different country desks. There was a real difference between those who chose to ultimately apply for their CUAET and try to make the effort to come to Canada versus those that decided to go to one of the other European desks, like in the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, etc., who had generous programs and could easily be accessed by bus or by train. And it gave people that optionality to potentially just, take the train back to Ukraine if this doesn't work out for them, or they wanted to stay close to loved ones. And we were able to prove this out even further by comparing the data of war-displaced Ukrainians in the EU versus the war-displaced Ukrainians within our survey in Canada. So we compared it to this study conducted in September by the Center for Economic Strategy, which surveyed Ukrainians in several European countries. I believe it included Germany, Italy, France, and perhaps some other ones, and asked them some key questions about their experience. So the first is, how satisfied were with their current situation? So about two-thirds said that they're satisfied with their life in Europe. The employment rate was only 43%, which is, relatively low. And then their intentions to return to Ukraine, 63% intended on returning. And again, this speaks to that idea of being close, being a train ride away, versus those who went to Canada. So this is from our survey. You can see here 79% are satisfied with their life in Canada. So that's a pretty stark kind of contrast to those who went to Europe. And this is in spite of Canada, let's say, giving less kind of direct supports to the Ukrainians beyond that one-time payment. The second is the employment rate. So you see the employment rate here, the 76% against the 43%. The ones that went to Canada knew that they had to work to be able to sustain themselves because they weren't getting those benefits. The people that we were talking to with their CUETs, we had people in their 70s or 80s asking for a work permit because they wanted to work. They wanted to be able to support themselves. They wanted to be independent. And so you see here that the ones that came here came with that mentality. And then finally, if you look at their intention to return post CUET, only 2% said that they would want to return to Ukraine, which is again vastly different than the intention to return to Ukraine versus those in Europe. And so you start to see that there's these two different mindsets and intentions of these populations, and hence you can't paint both with the same brush. So this brings us to that key question of how many Ukrainians want to stay in Canada after their CUET, after their open work permit or study permit runs out after those 3 years. And we found that 90% of CUET holders want to obtain PR. The remaining 10%, 8% weren't exactly sure at that time, and 2% said that they would explicitly want to return to Ukraine. And of that 90%, we had people that had already applied. We had some people that were thinking about it, and some people that did intend to apply when the time was right. And interestingly, 79% said that even if the war were to end tomorrow, 79% said that they would still stay in Canada. So the question is why? Why is it that they want to stay in Canada? Well, you see here the primary reason was that they want a better future for their children. And this was, we saw, answered by people who didn't even necessarily have children. They just wanted a better future for themselves and for their children if they wanted to perhaps have children in the future. Because if you think about some of the discussions we had with people where they said, I've been displaced or been in the middle of a war since 2014. Full scale was just, the second echo of that first invasion. And they've lived in this kind of constant fear. And so Canada represented to them safety. It's further than Europe. It wouldn't be exposed to a war again, God forbid. And so it was really about making a future choice for their future, for their children's future, and to bring safety. And if you look in those kind of red bars there too, you see that 44% said that they have nothing to return to because their homes or livelihoods have been destroyed. 34% feared of being caught in the conflict again. And we saw this very commonly amongst people who were displaced perhaps in the first invasion because they were based in Crimea or Donetsk or places like that. So the question is, okay, if 90% want to pursue PR, what's their kind of pathway to obtain PR? Well, the answer is that many did not know which program to pursue. 40% said that they don't know yet. And you can read within our full report, the 37-page report, You can read about what were the things that they weren't sure about. They weren't sure about things like eligibility criteria, but also part of the problem was where the sources of information they're getting about which route to pursue. Sometimes it was informal, things like Telegram or Facebook. So, really there wasn't a clear kind of direction on which program to go after. And you see some other folks are kind of pursuing these other different programs. But what's interesting is that you see in the yellow box there, 23% indicated they're considering pursuit of one or more programs. Now, that's not necessarily the wisest choice given the amount of effort, the eligibility requirements, the costs, and things like that. So clearly, they're not necessarily getting the best advice, or it's not clear to them as to which will give them the best chances. It's generally a sign of, let's say, confusion or just a lack of, options. So this is an indicator to us of the need of a clearer pathway. So then we asked, okay, if you don't obtain PR, depending on whatever route you end up going with, what will you do? 49% said that they would pursue humanitarian and compassionate considerations, which is a very kind of specialized program that has a very low approval rate. It was 30% in 2021, but will likely be going even lower as the number of approvals per the IRCC levels plan will be capped at around 8,000, which is, slowly reducing it to about half its size for this upcoming year. So it's just not necessarily a great option. And if you have 49% of potential, people who don't get PR going for this route directly, it's simply not feasible. We'll talk more about it later, but it will just, gum up and clog this H&C program. We also want to note that if people do not get PR, only 14% said that they would return to Ukraine explicitly. You see here that these other options, like move to another country in Europe, got 21%, or move to a country outside of EU was another option. So, like go to the United States or the UK or others. So, their default answer, if they don't get PR, was not necessarily to go back to Ukraine anyway. This again speaks to this intentionality of why they came here. So the question is, why don't the current immigration programs fit? Why don't the current PR programs seem to fit? Well, as mentioned earlier, the fact that they weren't kind of deemed refugees from the beginning, even though many would argue that war-displaced Ukrainians are de facto refugees, have similar circumstances. They weren't given given that status. They weren't given the access to those benefits. You saw that in the early days of the resettlement of CUAET holders in Canada, some of those things like the health benefits that would have been guaranteed to refugees was not provided to Ukrainians. The provinces had to kind of come up with their own policies and programs. It was created all ad hoc. And one of the other features of refugee status, obviously, is that kind of immediate route to PR. So what we believe is that because they weren't given refugee status from the very beginning, it has inhibited their ability to get PR at all, despite having very similar circumstances to a refugee. The second is the economic programs, so things like Express Entry or the Provincial Nominee Program are unfitting for war-displaced people. If you think about it, people who are economic migrants, they understand their, profile, they understand the decision they're making, they understand what they need to do to make themselves increase their likelihood of obtaining PR at some point. But when you're a war-displaced person, you don't have the time to make those conscious efforts, do the math, and figure that all out. We saw them dragging their kids and their luggage and pets. They didn't have the time to kind of think about, well, what would be my score on Express Entry while they were thinking about the decision to come to Canada. So these programs as we note here, are really best suited for people that are under the age of 30. Now, from the data we got from the IRCC in our access to information request, roughly 60% of CUAET holders are above the age of 30. If you're over 30, your points are going to get knocked down a lot if you're over the age of 30, and they diminish as that increases. So really, like 60% of these CUAET holders are already at a significant disadvantage. The second, it really is designed for those who are working in high-skilled jobs. And while Ukrainians, I believe, are the fourth most educated people in the world, 50%, as we mentioned, are still working in sectors and at levels that were below their work in Ukraine. And so they aren't really able to kind of even demonstrate their abilities while here in Canada because of these limitations, because of these challenges in obtaining jobs, and that's partly tied to being able to obtain PR. The third kind of criteria of like who is these economic programs can benefit are those who can train or upskill. So it wasn't until recently that, CUAET holders had to either work or study. So many of these Ukrainians, I believe it's around 30%, you'll see in our full report, we talk about how many of them held licenses in Ukraine and how many of them are trying to get it recognized here in Canada. Many of those that are here cannot train or upskill, or if they want to try to, they're paying non-resident fees for tuition at universities, which are, 2 times or more the domestic rate. And so it's prohibitively expensive to get an education here in Canada without, savings and all that other stuff. So it's really difficult for people to be able to even try to, let's say, go to college, get a degree, et cetera, et cetera. There are some provinces that have tried to make these accommodations, like Saskatchewan, that makes tuition at resident rates. But again, this is something that has to be decided at the provincial levels or at the university institution level. And then finally, these scores themselves are moving goalposts. You may have been, within a target score in September, but by December, you are not high enough. And so these moving goalposts are just to make these programs increasingly out of reach of CUAET holders who are really trying to establish themselves, get stability, they have families to worry about, and they're still handling the kind of post-traumatic stress of, the impacts of war, for example. So it's just very kind of difficult for them to be able to compete on all these different levels. And then finally, when going back to that humanitarian and compassionate considerations, as I mentioned, 49% saying that they indicated that they would go for this option if they can obtain PR. 49% of them. The success rate is low, 30%, or it's going to even go even lower, very likely as more people apply and the program approval level will get smaller. The second is that there's a lengthy process and a significant amount of paperwork. These immigration advisors and lawyers, many of them are well-intentioned and do want to help, but we've heard many stories of them, by default recommending this route. It costs a significant amount of money. We've heard between $3,000 to $10,000 per family, and really have no outcome guarantees. So, and it's really kind of dependent on the IRCC officer that's processing your submission to determine whether or not you get the outcome. So, it's really not a guarantee. It's really uncertain. It's expensive, and quite frankly, there's very few spots. And so if we compare the structural challenges, the way the programs are designed versus the capacity challenges, if we look at the immigration levels plan published by the IRCC about a month or two ago, if you think about 200,000 or so potential PR applicants, they'd be competing for these limited spots. And if you look at the levels for the economic and the humanitarian categories, that's just going to be competing with a significant number of other immigrants, economic migrants, other people that will be applying for humanitarian and compassionate considerations and competing against other CUAET holders. So it's just, there isn't enough spots to compete under, the existing structural conditions, but also just the numbers, the capacity. So we'll share later on Bogdana's story, who is one of our Pathfinders volunteers, and she shares about the skills and experience that she brings to Canada, but has been unsuccessful in really finding a way to get PR under the current regimes.
Very briefly, my story that originally I'm from Crimea. I was born in Crimea, and after an annexion, I moved to Kiev by thinking that I will be safe there. But this full-scale invasion, it became for me like a decision point when I just realized that I want to live in a safe place. And actually, that's why I also prioritize Canada over the EU, because I saw this as a possibility, you know, like to move to a country and build my life while remaining Ukrainian and well connected to Ukrainian diaspora. And at the moment I was coming to Canada, I actually, because I already knew at the time that I want to stay, I took a consultation with immigration consultant, and we made this calculation on this online system. And because of my education level and age and my experience, so my score at that moment was pretty high. It was about like 490 till 500. And the immigration consultant told me, like, don't bother going Manitoba or somewhere where you will have less career possibilities for your background. So just go right straight away to Ontario, and after 1 year of experience, you will be able to get in. But I don't know how many of you are following the current situation. For the last like 7-8 months, the score in Express Entry went as high as it never been, and the latest score reached 560. So like now, for example, I already don't have this chance to pass through this Express Entry, even so my score is high enough. And we believe that it's also one of the problem we need to address, like that even there were some doors of opportunities for Ukrainians, and Ukrainians maybe could count on them, but now they are closing one after another. And it's becoming more and more challenging to get your PR until you don't have a pathway for it. Thank you.
And so that brings us to who are the uncertain majority. So the uncertain majority refers to the population of the war-displaced Ukrainians that we expect will apply for PR, so that 90% of the 210,000 that have arrived so far. This reflects the ones that we expect will get PR and the ones that won't get PR or are uncertain to get PR. That's the uncertain majority. So who is confident in their ability to get PR? Well, first, it's the 7% of those that we surveyed that said that they have immediate Canadian family members. So per that policy that was announced on October 23rd, which said that people with Canadian resident or citizen immediate family members, meaning grandparents, parents, siblings, spouses, or children, they would be eligible for this family reunification program. And what we expected was that this would not benefit a significant number of CUAET holders, and according to our data, it says only 7%. The remaining here is 23% who indicated that they would be very confident or confident in obtaining PR or have already obtained PR. So of the people we surveyed, these are the people who believe that they will get PR. And we, you know, to some degree trust what they're saying, because many of them have already begun the processes of speaking to consultants. They're doing their scores on these calculators that are available online, and they're talking to other kind of people who have been successful in obtaining PR. So, you know, this total here, this 30% represent, let's say, the folks that are likely to obtain PR, which leaves us with this 70% uncertain majority. And if you do the 70% on the 90% of people who are likely to apply for PR, on the 210,000 people that have arrived, that equates to roughly 132,000 people who do not feel confident or not confident at all or are unsure if they are able to get PR under the current circumstances. And so, who are these people? What does the profile look like of this uncertain majority? These are the people who, in, let's say 1.5 to 3 years, at the end of their CUAET, will be faced with a huge dilemma. Will they have to leave? Will they have to figure out some other way to stay? These are the people that just don't see a clear pathway to PR. And what's their profile? Well, they are high value contributors to our economy. 92% of this subset of the population say that they have a bachelor's or a master's degree. 28% report being in management or executive roles in their jobs. And 74% of them are employed. So it's a little slightly less than the overall population we've talked about before, but still quite a high number. And what's the other profile inside of their story is the humanitarian and compassionate consideration type factors of this subpopulation. 45% of the uncertain majority have children in school. And so that means in 3 years, they may be faced with a very difficult situation where they're telling their kids, I know that you've been learning English and French. I know that you've been making friends, but we need to go back. That's just a heartbreaking decision for any parent to make. 34% are getting involved in local organizations or volunteering with these organizations. They're the church groups, the community organizations, the sports clubs, the art clubs, and things like that. And then of this subset, 71% said they have nothing to return to in Ukraine due to the destruction or that kind of fear of being caught in the conflict, etc. So these people really demonstrate both kind of an economic case. They are working, they have a lot to contribute. And then second, they have these humanitarian considerations where, these are people that are really trying to integrate into Canadian society and have a real kind of reason as to why they feel like they aren't able to go back to Ukraine. And what's also interesting to point out here when we were talking about those economic classes and the age challenge, 68% of the uncertain majority are over the age of 30, making the scores of their kind of ability to get PR very challenging. So it actually makes sense that most of this uncertain majority, the people who said that they don't feel confident in their ability to get PR, 68% of them are over the age of 30, which makes sense. So we're going to pivot towards, we've demonstrated a case as to, why, a lot of people want to get PR. A lot of people don't feel confident in their ability to get PR, but we see economic and humanitarian reasons as to why they should get PR. But we come across these anti-PR narratives, and we see this in the media, or we hear it from other organizations or from other officials. And we want to address them based upon our data and some of the kind of anecdotal evidence that we have. So one thing that we commonly hear is that Ukrainians should return to their country to rebuild. Now, first and foremost, we feel like this is ultimately a personal decision of what's best for your family. This is a decision of what we saw in the data where people were deciding to stay in Canada because they wanted a better future for their children. That was the foremost reason why. It wasn't economic reasons. It was they want a better future for their kids. And so this is a personal decision, and no government should force people into these really difficult situations or obligations. The second is, okay, if they want, even if they did want to stay and that was their personal decision for their family, it doesn't mean that they're not going to support the rebuild at all. And as we mentioned in that stat about the contributions to rebuild, 99% want to contribute to rebuild, and 68% of them would do so through remittances to family or to organizations. 17% want to support through working for Canadian companies that are working directly on rebuild. So, They don't necessarily need to go back to contribute to rebuild. They can earn great Canadian wages, they can pay taxes in Canada, and still have a significant amount of money that they can invest in their own families and also invest in sending back to Ukraine. And we've also seen in studies of post-war Europe, for example, where after World War II, many of the diaspora that left as a result of the war from Western Europe, for example, and moved to the North America, it created all these great corridors of exchange, of joint projects, of the flow of knowledge, the flow of funds, and the flow of collaboration. So we see this as an opportunity to build that kind of corridor of collaboration between Canada and Ukraine through the diaspora and through these war-displaced Ukrainians. The next is we hear keeping the war-displaced Ukrainians here would lead to a significant brain drain. Now, if we look at it just from a numbers perspective, the arrivals in Canada represent only about 3% of the total war-displaced population if you look at the UNHCR numbers. And so, it's not a huge amount of those that have left. Most of them have gone to Europe. And as we've seen in that prior data, many of those intend to return to Ukraine anyway. So the folks that'll go to Canada, it's quite a small number, and only 210,000 have arrived so far. And, even if they didn't obtain PR, only 14% said that they would want to return to Ukraine if they don't get PR. So it's not like these folks would want to make the choice to come back to Ukraine immediately anyway. They wouldn't do so under their own volition per se. And then finally, we've heard the argument that PR sends a signal of no confidence to the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, we're of the position that Canada's vote of confidence in the AFU continues through the military aid that's provided by our government. And we believe that that will continue, and we see that there's support for that. And interestingly, in our respondents, 11% of them said that they have family members that are serving within the AFU currently. And so what we've been told by them, and even speaking to, via some of these families to the service members, is that they feel more relief and safety and comfort knowing, their kids are going to school and their spouses and loved ones are working and are safe and living a life in Canada. So it actually helps kind of embolden them and give them that kind of comfort knowing that their family is doing well while they can courageously continue the fight in Ukraine. So how did we synthesize these sentiments into a proposal? And so when we closed the survey in September and then came up with thinking of how do we approach proposing a pathway to PR for war-displaced Ukrainians, we weighed different options. And if you read the full report, you'll see some of the options that we weighed. But we felt the fastest route with least resistance would be through a temporary public policy, which is within the purview and authority of the Canadian Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. And it's been done for other non-refugee status populations before to give them pathways to PR. I think most recently it was with the Hong Kong residents who were potentially facing, political situations in Hong Kong, and they were given a route to PR in Canada. Now, we wanted to create criteria for a pathway to PR that acknowledges those that are most kind of in need of PR in terms of, being directly impacted by the war. So we introduced this idea of having criteria where they had to demonstrate that they had resided in Ukraine as at February 1st, 2014, which was roughly when the first invasion of Ukraine happened by Russia. So as at February 1st, 2014 or later, And as you saw in our earlier data, about 3/4 of the respondents we surveyed were in Ukraine as at February 24th, 2022, so would be eligible under this criteria. The second is we wanted them to demonstrate that they've been working for 1 year full-time or part-time equivalent, so putting together some part-time together to equate to a full year in a NOC tier 0 to 3 job, so a skilled working class, or in these in-demand job categories. So for example, personal support workers, logistics workers, things like that for certain jobs where Canada has high demand for them, but are not necessarily skilled. And then finally, we wanted to have some threshold around language levels. So we said CLB5, which we feel is, relatively attainable within a year of being in Canada. And 54% of the uncertain majority that we spoke about actually report English fluency. So it's certainly attainable for that group. So we wanted to propose this temporary public policy because it's a quick route that the minister could exercise to be able to provide a pathway to PR that captures that uncertain majority beyond that family reunification program. And this is just a proposal of some of the ideas that we have. Of course, it's up to the discretion of the minister, and we would have a kind of time frame around this as it is a temporary public policy. So one of the other things that we were interested in knowing was, okay, we have this proposal for PR. It's within the minister's authority. Would Canadians support it? Recently, from November 24th to 26th, Leger, a very reputable polling agency within Canada, conducted a poll of Canadians and found that 54% said that they would support giving a permanent pathway to Ukrainians who came to Canada under the emergency visa program. And only 23% said that they were opposed. So even though 54% doesn't sound like a high percentage, the other way to look at it is only 23% of people are opposed. And where we see the opportunity here, and we believe that it's actually higher in terms of the support level, is that 22% said that they do not know or prefer not to answer. And we think that part of this is probably a perception or education challenge because many Canadians believe that war-displaced Ukrainians are refugees and already have that entitlement to PR. And so we feel like if people get to know the situation better, hear the stories of war-displaced Ukrainians, and get to see how hardworking and how contributing they are to the Canadian society and economy, people would be much more supportive of this pathway. So we see this as a starting point, but we see the kind of final support as much, much higher. So one of the other questions is, okay, why do we care about this now? And the reality is that first cohort of CUAET holders that came to Canada, arriving in the kind of, March, April, springtime of 2022, they have about a year and a half or less left on their open work permit or study permit. And so this is really meaning a sense of urgency. And, for maybe someone in government or, someone in Canada, Canadian, a year and a half may sound like a long time, but we recognize that there's real direct and indirect costs, not only to the CUAET holders themselves, but we believe also to government. So for the CUAET holders, there's real financial pain of not being a resident. So that includes, paying higher non-resident tuition fees, not being eligible for certain tax credits, not being eligible for certain kind of health programs and things like that. We've seen stories of children with physical disabilities being denied special kind of programs and coverage. So there's real out-of-pocket costs and opportunity costs that are paid by not being a resident. The second is we've heard, unfortunately, stories of exploitation and profiteering. Because they don't have a clear pathway to PR, you have some of these people who are immigration consultants or lawyers that see this opportunity to charge, significant fees to pursue programs that really they have very low or no chance in actually obtaining. And we've also heard in some cases of employers asking, the CUAET holder to pay for the LMIAs or pay kind of these these fees, these additional kind of off the record fees to get these letters. And so we feel like it's allowing these vulnerable people to be exploited further. The third is we've heard about career limitation and employer hesitancy when it comes to CUAET holders. So imagine you're an employer and you have a CUAET holder who either applies to your job or is currently working in your job, and you know the clock is ticking and they may have about a year and a half left or less. Do you want to invest in training them further? Do you want to promote them to management? Do you want to give them a promotion and pay them more if you know that they're going to be gone in a year and a half? So we know that it's not only resulting in them being denied job opportunities, it's also being denied promotions and growth opportunities. So there's that real cost when it comes to progression. The third is, or sorry, the fourth here is that we've spoken to psychologists and other people who have worked directly with war-displaced people, and we know that this uncertainty and this anxiety that's caused by not knowing what the future holds, and that can be in the context of the war, but also in things like PR and what happens, a year and a half from now, it can really have a mental toll on people. And this is felt not only by the parents, but the children as well. You can imagine the stress and trauma it would cause a child to be plucked out of school potentially in a year and a half with all the friends that they've made and the clubs and things that they've joined since coming to Canada. And we've heard so many incredible kind of success stories of families integrating Canadian society. It would just be another trauma on these people. Um, and then finally, the cost of potential return. I mean, we talked about how it was roughly about $6,800 to come to Canada on average for these families. To go to pocket again to make the way back would again be a significant cost to these people. So, we not only feel like this is a significant cost out of pocket for them, but some of them may not have anything to return to, as we indicated with some of the data that they felt like there was nothing to return to due to destruction. So what money will they need to get a temporary life set up again in Ukraine? So there's real costs to not giving that clarity around their future prospects for PR. What does this mean to government, our government? Well, if you don't give them a clear pathway to PR, we saw the 49% that will go for humanitarian and compassionate claims. We saw that some people will go for a mixture of programs. This is going to contribute to the backlogs and burdens of IRCC. We know that they've been, really, burdened by a lot of these different applicants, all these parallel programs going on, and we really commend them for their efforts with CUAET. If you look at 1.2 million applicants, but if you add on to these people who have to process these claims or these applications for PR, and you don't give them a clear pathway, you are filling their kind of workload with people who really just shouldn't be there. So we feel like without a clear pathway, this will just add to the burdens of IRCC. The second is, I think we should recognize the real contributions, the quote unquote down payment that Ukrainians have been making while they've been here as tax-paying citizen or tax-paying individuals here in Canada. They've been, the 76% that have been working have been paying taxes, have been, contributing to society. And many of them have moved to provinces that may not be the first choice of many new immigrants to Canada. And many are working in jobs that maybe not many Canadians would want to take on anyway. And so there's real kind of contributions that Ukrainians are making, not only from a kind of tax payment perspective, but also, addressing real needs in terms of the labor market here in Canada. And then finally, Canada had built an incredible reputation through the efforts in supporting Ukrainians. You can see in our full report that, the war-displaced Ukrainians hold in really high esteem the people of Canada, the Canadian government, and the NGOs in their support of war-displaced Ukrainians during since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The landlords, not as much, but really, Canada's built a lot of goodwill. We were home to one of the largest Ukrainian diaspora prior to the full-scale invasion. About 1.3 million Canadians call themselves Ukrainian Canadians, including myself. And so we would lose a lot by turning our backs on these people who are really in need. And we feel like there is a pathway, a clear case as to why a program should help address their circumstances. So what's the case ultimately for creating a PR route for war-displaced Ukrainians, in particular addressing that uncertain majority? Well, it can be boiled down to these four kind of core areas, which we believe delivers a balanced win for all, and all being the war-displaced Ukrainians, to Canadian government and Canadian society, and even the government of Ukraine. So first, it allows us to retain tax-paying economic contributors and skilled workers here in Canada. So it gives them, a PR gives them a better prospect to get better jobs, to both study and work, to upskill, and to realize that full potential. Just imagine that 50% of Ukrainians working in sectors and at levels that they weren't before. Imagine what we can unlock for our economy in that sense. The second is to demonstrate compassion to those who have nothing to return to or could face danger. In this kind of principle of non-refoulement, you can't put people into dangerous situations or send them back, kick them out of your country, and put them into perilous conditions. So this would really help us uphold our humanitarian obligations and reputation. And that includes not, tearing kids out of school. The third is we believe that this will open up a lot of new opportunities to support the rebuild via remittances and diasporic partnerships. So, the war-displaced Ukrainians can earn, much better wages here in Canada, can send some of that money back to Ukraine, support organizations, family members still there, work for Canadian companies that are supporting the rebuild, because this is going to be an all-hands effort. It's going to be Ukrainians and Canadians that are here helping the Ukrainians that are there. It's going to be Canadians and Ukrainians who perhaps go back and support the rebuild. So this will help build those relationships, partnerships that'll be both financial, operational, project-based, knowledge-based. This is a kind of win-win in that sense as well. And then finally, we've heard so many of these stories of people that since 2014, they've been experiencing multiple displacements. They lived in Crimea and then moved up to Donetsk, or then Donetsk to Kyiv and things like that. And we've just heard of so many of these people who've had multiple displacements since 2014. And it's just not kind of fair to the individual and to these families to put them through another displacement and to disrupt their lives again. And we feel like this stability can allow them to thrive and can really allow them to be able to enjoy their lives and build a better future for their families, for Canada, and ultimately feed that back to Ukraine. So where do we all go from here? Well, our go-forward plan is to obviously launch this report, and we'll need to raise funds and create better kind of awareness of our research and our efforts. We are an all-volunteer organization, so we need to amplify the story of this report. In the new year, we plan on launching a petition around providing a pathway to PR for Ukrainians. That means calling on not just war-displaced Ukrainians, but the everyday Canadians to help support us in this effort. And then we'd want to also in 2024 onwards, really focus on getting the word out in the media, creating greater public awareness, and really showing that Canadians and Ukrainians agree that this is something that they can get behind. And then finally, we'd like to begin to also think about how do we build those corridors for rebuild, even start thinking about them today. How do we invest in the kind of people that are here currently, build those relationships between Canadians and those, high potential war displaced Ukrainians, and then allow them to start thinking about joint rebuild projects that leverage the best of both worlds. So how can you help in this effort? If you're able to contribute to our campaign, we'd greatly appreciate that. Like I mentioned, we're all volunteers. We don't receive any funding from the IRCC or the government. And so your contributions allow us to kind of host these events, produce this content, things like that, which really help us get awareness out there. The second is to join our mailing list. You'll see a QR code at the end of the presentation where you can scan and join our mailing list and let us know how you want to get involved. We're looking for volunteers, everyone from experts in communication, policy, marketing, community building, hosting events, things like that. There are a lot of different ways to get involved. And we're hoping for not just war-displaced Ukrainians who are trying to, put up a fight to get what we believe that they deserve, but also to help get Canadians who really demonstrate compassion for the Ukrainian cause to help these people like yourselves, perhaps. And then finally, you can follow us on social media at Pathfinders for Ukraine on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And then finally, our ask is to share this report and perhaps share this video with your local MP and other Canadians. A message to the war-displaced Ukrainians who may be listening to this right now. You are our best advocate for this. The hard work you do at work, the communities that you're getting involved with, the kids who are making friends with Canadian kids, those are the best ambassadors and the best cases as to why PR should be given as a pathway for your future. You show how hardworking you are, how you're contributing, how you want to just create a better life for your families. That inspires Canadians because we need you to help us make the case at that individual level and show Canadians as to why they should care and why they should advocate it. And to the Canadians that are perhaps listening, it's ultimately us who have to really amplify the voices of these war-displaced Ukrainians. Even from a procedural level, when it comes to signing some of these petitions, we need Canadian residents and citizens. So that's one way that you can particularly help. But also voicing the concerns to your local members of parliament as constituents. Your voice has to be heard. And so if you can amplify the voices of this cause, of the families that your kids go to school with, that you work with at work, if you can articulate this pathway, this case with the experience that you've had, I believe that we'll be able to find a clear path forward. So on behalf of the Pathfinders team who helped produce the report, a mix and a great example of collaboration between Canadians and war-displaced Canadians, war-displaced Ukrainians, a great collaboration manifested in this report. So feel free to scan the QR codes on the left to help contribute to our campaign. Any little bit helps. And then to join our mailing list where you can identify how you'd like to get involved. And then, of course, on the bottom there are socials as well as our email if you have any questions. So again, I want to thank you for you taking the time to listen to the case that we believe we've made for providing a pathway to PR for war-displaced Ukrainians. We believe that the future discussion should not be focused on, let's say these pathways to PR, but thinking about how do we work together to help with the rebuild of Ukraine, which will be the greatest undertaking of rebuild, of collaboration, and of rebirth since the Second World War. So we look forward to doing that together with you. Feel free to reach out. And of course, Slava Ukraini. Thank you.